So over the last 12 months, we have released a couple videos looking at the subject of iconic watches. The first video was looking at watches under $1,000 that could be deemed as iconic. Then we jumped up an additional $1,000, looking up to $2,000 looking at iconic watches. But then we started to go through the process of what if we stretched out the budget to $3,000, and the list of watches that fell in that range were not enough to allow it to be its own video. I'm pretty strict on using that language of iconic. So what I wanted to do instead was stretch out that budget, do the next segment of this series, looking at some of the most iconic watches from $3,000 to $10,000. When looking at the field of watches at play, this felt like the best range to look at next. This will easily be the most comprehensive of lists in looking at this broader category, but you're looking at some true icons of icons in the list here today. So the word of the day seems to be iconic, so maybe we should just describe what we're talking about here and then go from there. So by the book, if we're looking at a true definition, we have a person or thing regarded as a representative symbol or as worthy of veneration. Now, some of the factors I was considering when looking at having something qualify for this list were the following, and I will say that you don't need to have all of these as part of the formula, but it is helpful to have all of them to be deemed an icon. First is being historically impactful. This could be recent history, but you wanna have some influence in that regard. Then you had the concept of a legendary design. Did it help establish characteristics going forward for other watches to follow and maybe be more recognizable as a result? I talked about influence a little bit with history, but how did the watch have an effect on collectors, the industry, and pop culture? And then further, in terms of what we're talking about, under $10,000, but we're also looking at watches that are currently in production and watches you can get under $10,000 today. And because of the wide variety of watches we're going to be talking about, I'm not going to be going through every single detail about these watches, but more talking about why they've been able to reach that iconic status and give some of the backstory or some of the importance of why they've been able to reach that level. So to kick things off, we're gonna look at Zenith, and just as a warning, we're not going through this in any particular order. These were just things that came to mind as I was putting this together, and I was also batching together some of the brands. But Zenith needs to be on here for their Chronomasters. If you go back to 1969, you had the launch of one of the contenders for the first automatic winding chronograph and an early trailblazer of high beat calibers to go along with it, with the Zenith El Primero. This movement was revolutionary, and I would argue that it's maybe one of the most recognizable or discussed movements. I mean, think about it. How many movements do we know by name? That's not something that happens very often. It had a rate of 36,000 vibrations per hour, 5 hertz, and then the modern Chronomaster original is memorialized really by that original design cue of that A386. There's several things about this design that allow it to stand out. One is going to be the caliber on the inside. The case is recognizable and how it sits on the wrist. Also the layout of those 3 registers in that tri-colored format. You have a distinctive case in this instance. You have 38 millimeters, making for one of the more wearable automatic chronographs on the market in this segment. The recent updated Chronomaster original, now available in stainless steel standard production, has a 60-hour power reserve for the 3600 movement, which also has a 1/10 of a second indication with that running chronograph hand. These watches have gone up in price in recent years. I have one on a strap on my wrist as I'm recording this video, and this is a watch still that you can get for under $10,000. So I was really struggling on what to do with TAG Heuer. They obviously need to be on this list, but I was trying to figure out what is the most appropriate watch or watches to have on a list like this. One that came to mind was the Carrera. If it was just merely by name alone, the Carrera needs to be mentioned as an iconic watch. But the problem for me was, what is the modern creation from the Carrera family that best upholds those original core principles? You could argue the glass box, and as much as I would say that watch is absolutely phenomenal and probably one of the best releases from TAG Heuer recently, it is a bit of a different package compared to the original form. So if I had to pick one watch from TAG Heuer that preserves a singular identity with little variance over the years, it'd have to be the Monaco. So the Monaco was one of these early vehicles of those early automatic chronograph movements, and in the years to come, throughout the tumultuous up and down that were the coming decades with Heuer and eventually TAG Heuer in the 1980s, the Monaco remains a cult classic with no direct rival. The Monaco's most recognizable trait has to be its K-shape, and at the time it presented some daunting technical challenges to overcome, most notably with water resistance of a square case chronograph as a result of the sealing and gasket technology at the time. Another factor that has to be thrown in here is the affiliation with racing. Steve McQueen famously wore the watch in the film Le Mans and cemented its immortality. The blue dial version seen here is the modern evolution of the original and upholds many of the same characteristics. So IWC also needs to be considered here under $10,000, and I think the aviation wing of the brand is probably where we need to look the most. IWC's aviation design is as rich as any, but we're gonna look more towards the 1940s here with the 1948 release of the Mark 11, giving way to the Mark series that would later come. So those Mark 11s were supplied to the British Ministry of Defense and really set forward a classic pilot's watch design and look. It was purpose-built, but it had this plainness that helps set a standard of one of the most familiar looks in watchmaking. So for the modern representation of the Mark series, you have the Mark 20. This replaced the Mark 18. They skipped 19, don't ask questions, they did it though. But with this new design, you have a easier wearing case. The lug to lug is going to be more compact. You have more water resistance, and the movement on the inside is going to have that 5 days of power reserve. So for the next watch here, this is one where maybe some might argue with me that did this reach iconic status yet? But I would argue it absolutely has because of what it did for a brand. Some of this historical impact, it doesn't need to be old. It can also be looking at what is new. And if Grand Seiko was going to be a brand, they needed a flagship product that was going to take them to new heights. They set forward this independence in 2017 to separate from Seiko, to really show what the brand has on offer outside of just Japan. And then you saw this total curiosity that would come towards the brand in the years to come. And a lot of that was only a result of having a watch like this one, the Snowflake. So the SBGA 211 is specifically the model we're gonna look at because that was the introduction of the Snowflake with the singular signed Grand Seiko dial. I think what made this watch so impactful is it had all the principles that people now affiliate with Grand Seiko in those early days and still to this moment. You have Zaratsu polishing on the case. You have exquisite dial detailing from the natural imagery of the snowy landscapes that you would find outside of the Shinshu watch studio. You have the movement tech, and then also their own proprietary form of titanium as well. The incredible depth and texture of that blinding white dial was a revelation, getting its amazing brightness from, believe it or not, silver plating. Now you could argue there are many watches from Grand Seiko nowadays that can go toe to toe with the Snowflake and maybe even outduel it when it comes to what is bringing forth. But I would argue that there's no other watch from Grand Seiko that is as important as this one in allowing them to become really a welcome member on the global watchmaking stage. So this next watch is going to be one that not only represents an important aspect of a brand's history, but also just watchmaking history in upholding the idea of an entire genre. Now, there are other watches being made of this style from brands that maybe don't have the same history, but it felt more appropriate to be looking at a brand that was proudly making these back in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Here we have the Longines Legend Diver. So this is a genuine historic callback to 1959 with the original, the reference 7042. These were recently unveiled with 39mm cases, but why I wanted to mention this watch is this upholds those EPSA cases of compressor styles from the 1960s. So what these watches essentially were back in the day, and now this is more of a compressor style, but the case back would press into the gasket to create a tighter seal and then had these dual crown positions, with one of those crowns being responsible for adjusting the elapsed time bezel on the internal side of the case. These are gorgeously designed, wonderfully executed. The modern editions also have ISO certifications for their specs and magnetism. You have a COSC certified movement with a ton of retro charm and refinement. So another brand with a ton of aquatic lore that has to be mentioned, we have two watches here from Panerai, the Radiomir as well as the Luminor. So first up, the Radiomir. In 1916, Panerai filed a patent for a substance dubbed Radiomir, a luminescent material based on radium. 20 years later, Panerai manufactured 10 prototypes for the divers of the Italian Navy, with these watches later being known as the Radiomir, named after that patented material. But outside of this backstory, Panerai is a pop culturally relevant brand. You look at the late 1990s, 2000s, these watches were everywhere. And then also just their case silhouettes are some of the most recognizable in the industry. Maybe not as much with the Radiomir compared to the Luminor, but still very much the case. If you see this watch from across the room, you know what it is. Other aspects are just their large case presence. You have the sandwich dial and then the lume underneath that being fully polished with its case. On the other side, you have the Luminor, and there's one aspect of these watches that is absolutely unparalleled in its design, and that is that crown locking system. That flip-lock crown guard system was patented in the 1950s, and this is a watch that's a dead giveaway for an entire brand. You look at this, you know what it is. Across the room, you could be squinting, you might have bad eyesight. You know that that's a Panerai. And again, that huge popularity surge that you saw with Panerai came from the 1990s, 2000s, these being worn by the likes of Schwarzenegger as well as Stallone. This next piece is one that barely makes the cut now, unfortunately, for being included on this list if you're looking at a mechanical option, but it does make the cut, and I think it absolutely needs to be here, the JLC Reverso. Specifically, we're looking at the Tribute Monoface. This is a more simple execution of the Reverso, but if you know the Reverso, there is absolutely nothing simple about it. This case itself is so difficult to construct. You're looking at over 50 components just for the case alone. So for some context around the backstory of this piece, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, there was a Swiss businessman and watch distributor named Cesar de Trey. He attended a polo match between British Army officers while traveling in India, where one of those officers wearing a watch during the match had their crystal shattered. Following that, request came to get a watch to not have crystals that would fall victim to a similar fate. The design in 1931 that ultimately came was of the utmost originality, having a patented reversible watch case that protects the crystal by sliding horizontally to one side and then flipping over, exposing the solid case back, protecting the glass and the dial behind it. Outside of the Cartier tank, there is not a single rectangular watch style that is going to be as iconic as the Reverso. The way the central case is able to flip around is one thing, but also the design style with its line groove pattern on the sides of the case, as well as how it sits on the wrist and presents itself, is unlike any other. So this is one of the most recently created watches on this list that I am saying is an icon, but I think you could argue it for a variety of reasons. This is the Tudor Black Bay. So I think the reason why so many people ultimately say this watch is iconic is not the reason why I am going to be arguing for its case. Yes, you have the affiliation with the Tudor Submariners as well as Rolex, and that is always going to allow you to have more brand cachet, but I would argue the reason why the Tudor Black Bay is so important is because of what it did commercially for a variety of people, both for Tudor themselves and allowing them to extend what they were doing. They are now known as a global player. In 2012, they were a very different brand. They were not necessarily out of business, but they were not known as much as they are today. And you've seen this really rapid ascension of the brand in the years to follow. But also, I would argue the Tudor Black Bay changed the market dynamics of watches in that price segment of that $2,000 to $5,000. Maybe you can say up to $6,000 now, given what has happened with Omega and Rolex and continuing to go up with their prices. I know so many people on YouTube mention the Tudor Black Bay, but we have to give this watch its credit. It transformed the brand. It helped redefine that price range. It also was the framework where you saw more of the release of manufactured Canisi calibers on the inside. It's also the framework for the complications that would follow. You have a Black Bay chronograph, which for its price is probably one of the value leaders. You have a GMT as well, which was absolutely revolutionary. When the Tudor Black Bay GMT came out in 2018, there was really no competition for it. It was a true GMT, a Traveler GMT at a price range in that mid $3,000 range. Look around at that time, there was nothing available. This was before also the 4R34 movements, the 90-75 movements from Citizen Group. This was a totally different ball game, and it changed the entire attainable GMT market. I don't think we would see the same momentum that we saw from some of the other brands to catch up if it wasn't for the Tudor Black Bay GMT. Also, the whole idea around vintage-inspired dive watches really came from this watch, but also you have to give credit again to Longines. I forgot to mention with the Legend Diver how important that was back in 2007, I believe, where they brought that back. But the Black Bay was really the watch that truly made this, at this segment, an important trend. The 58, also mid-size dive watches, I mean, this is something that really was forward-looking based on where we're at now. Also, again, with the 54, there were just so many aspects of the Black Bay outside of just its affiliation with the Submariner in the past that I think has allowed it to be an icon of the 21st century. So now we're gonna shift over to Breitling, and I would argue when it comes to this level of icon status, Breitling has as many icons as almost any brand I can think of. They go toe-to-toe with a Rolex, they go toe-to-toe with an Omega, a Cartier. I mean, they have a lot underneath their stable. First is going to be the Breitling Navitimer. This is the icon of the brand in a field of icons. This was initially created alongside the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association back in 1952 and is arguably the most important pilot's chronograph in history from a brand that has been producing chronographs for well over a century. There were several aspects about this design that I think are noteworthy. One is going to be the innovation of the slide rule bezel. It was not the first watch from Breitling to have that slide rule, but I would argue it's the watch that really allowed it to be standard for them going forward. This was vital at the time too for in-flight calculations when in-flight instruments were more primitive at that period. Beautiful finishing and more wearable cases than you might expect. You have a 41mm option, a 43mm option, and a 46mm option. You also have intriguing dial choices to choose from. The B01 automatic chronograph movement helps set a standard for its price range. And its slide rule, distinct bezel edging has enabled this to be a symbolic piece of the skies. Now, another aviation watch from Breitling that needs to be considered here is the Chronomat. Now, the Chronomat was actually the first watch to feature a slide rule from Breitling and just in general in the industry. And it's one of the most iconic watches from the brand without question. The name goes back far, but I would argue where we're looking at for where did it reach that more iconic status, it would be in the 1980s, specifically in 1984 with the update to the design. So at this period, you saw the design that was developed in partnership with the Italian Air Force's Jet Aerobatic Squadron team. This is where you saw that rouleau bracelet coming into the fold with that comfortable design and also being one of the most recognizable in all of watchmaking. Then you also had those unique rider tabs on the bezel for timing different intervals and then being very easy to read and grip even with the use of gloves. Has 200 meters of water resistance, has sapphire crystal, several different dial variants to choose from, also now having that B01 movement on the inside. Another piece you have to consider is the aerospace. This is maybe not the watch that so many people consider when thinking of Breitling, but for analog digital watches, this is absolutely at the top or near the top as the most recognizable. The aerospace was first launched in 1985, becoming arguably one of the most important analog digital watches ever, while presenting some forward tech at the time. Its modern day iteration includes the titanium aerospace B70 Orbiter. Now, this model was created to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the record-setting circumnavigation of the Earth in the Breitling Orbiter 3 hot air balloon. This modern creation has a commemorative orange gradient dial, the B70 turbo-compensated super quartz movement, which is COSC certified and resistant to temperature changes, having an accuracy of plus or minus 10 seconds a year. And then one dive watch from Breitling, and this is, again, where you think about aviation so strongly with the brand that I think we overlook this aspect of them, which is going to be their diving history. In 1957, they came out with a watch known as the Super Ocean. And I would argue outside of the Omega Seamaster Diver 300, maybe you can argue the Tudor Black Bay now, and the Rolex Submariner, this would be the next in line for a dive watch at this price segment when you're talking about this level of legendary status. There are a couple iterations in the modern catalog that I would say better represent where I'm going with this. One would be the 57, but probably the best would be the Heritage editions, the Super Ocean Heritage. The Super Ocean, though, was easily one of the most important divers of the 1950s and early 1960s, being unveiled in 1957 specifically. In the early days, the Super Ocean had one of the most capable water resistance ratings and often was copied in its style. And the Super Ocean was also one of the platforms where you saw the adoption of diving chronographs. So now we shift over to Cartier, and the first watch we have to mention is the Santos de Cartier, or the Cartier Santos in general. Now you can just pick the option you want here. They're all going to be legendary designs, but they trace their roots back to a singular time. And that was in 1904 when aviator Alberto Santos Dumont asked Louis Cartier to design a more convenient way to check the time in flight than pulling out his pocket watch. The result was a vanguard of wristwatches, helping pave the way for the increasing popularity amongst men in the years to come. Now, the distinctive design featured a screwed squared bezel, Roman numerals, and an ornate crown, characteristics that are still very much a part of the DNA today. The modern version of the Santos de Cartier includes an automatic caliber, the 1847 MC, a slim profile, sapphire crystal, and 100 meters of water resistance, as the original Santos was a pretty capable purpose-built watch. Now, some might argue with me on this one, but I'm going to include it. This is the Pasha from Cartier. So the origin story around the Pasha dates back to the 1930s. A lot of lore around that, where they created a custom piece for the Pasha of Marrakesh. But there is not truly conclusive evidence that this is the case. But in any case, the modern Pasha also has something else to talk about, which is the design contribution from Gerald Genta in 1985, which featured some pretty notable designs. It had the broad bezel, the Vendome lugs, and a distinctive screw-down crown cap secured with a chain link, not unlike vintage Canteen watch crowns. The Pasha sits in a position where to some it's beloved, while to others its peculiarities are too much compared to the timeless universal appeal of the standard Cartier way that we typically see. Here's another watch in more recent history, but if you're looking at watches for women, and there are also watches available for men as well, in the 21st century that I would say are iconic has to be the Ballon Bleu. So this was originally created by Cartier in 2007, and Ballon Bleu, which means blue balloon from French, is appropriately named, and it features a unique round case profile with a convex case back and crystal. Its other hallmark is the fluted cabochon crown protected by the outer hoop, making for a distinctive case silhouette. Other iconic Cartier touches include the Roman numerals set against a guilloche dial and blue sword hands. At this price range for the Cartier tank, you do not have the Cartier tank Louis available to you in precious metal. Instead, you have to look at something like the Cartier tank Must. Here we have the extra large edition, but I would probably be running into some issues if I didn't include some type of Cartier tank here. Dating back to 1917 for that original tank design, this specific reference is the closest visual avatar of that tank Louis available. But in this case, it's gonna be available in steel, not precious metal. It's an undisputed style icon, it's timeless in its design, wears extremely well, has the pop cultural relevance to go along with it, and is also a watch that I would say extends past this idea of enthusiasm of just wristwatch enthusiasts and can extend into people that just love jewelry. And it's been able to appease both sides with how iconic it is. Some other honorable mentions I'll just bring up when talking about the Cartier tank. You have the American Large. That was introduced in 1987 as a modern take on the classic tank that was born 70 years earlier. Has a wearing experience that is much more contemporary with its long curved case that offers great wrist presence. You also have the Cartier Tank Francais that was launched in 1996. This has more of a stout square case compared to the traditional tank found most often on a matching bracelet. So I had to draw the line on Omega here. What are going to qualify as iconic? And I think you have to have a singular design identity. You have to have some historical impact on the brand. And I think the three that I've selected here, I feel the best about. The first here is the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter. So this is a separate take on the Seamaster family, especially opposed to the 1957 trilogy model, this one being born in the 1990s. And I think one thing that is overlooked with this piece is how it was able to truly bring back Omega to this strong point in the industry after a couple of decades of more of a rocky type of existence. This was also the watch responsible for forging that relationship with James Bond and Omega. That all started when Pierce Brosnan wore the 2541.80 in GoldenEye in 1995. The watch nowadays is one of the most superbly competent dive watches that you can come across. Has a fantastic coaxial master chronometer movement. A new black dial no date version just came out with its tighter weave pattern. And since the 1990s, outside of the technical performance as well as some of the material choices, it very much has sustained its image. And when you're talking about this price range, under $10,000, dive watches specifically, it's probably only second to the sub on that level of being recognizable. Then a watch that absolutely needs to be here, the Omega Speedmaster Moonwatch, Hesselite specifically. The 105.012 worn by Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were not only the first watches to be worn on the moon, they remain a core design identity to the Speedmaster today. The Speedmaster has all the lore it needs to be considered an icon, but its other crowning achievement, it's its coherence to the original formula. If you look at this, the Moonwatch design, I think its ability to just stay the path and not change that much is the reason why it's had this staying power. There are so many different spin-offs of the Speedmaster and they are excellent, but if we're going to try to determine the icon of the Speedmaster family, it has to be the Moonwatch. In 2021, the Moonwatch was updated for that latest generation. With that, it comes with a coaxial movement on the inside, also master chronometer certified, and it is available with a sapphire crystal as well as the vintage correct Hesselite as well. And then for my third choice here for an icon from Omega, we have the Constellation family. Now you could pick the Manhattan case versions or the Globe Master. I think all of them need to be considered here because I think the Constellation name is underappreciated, generally speaking, amongst the watch collecting public. The Constellation is this link to chronometry that you would see over the years from Omega. Now, the Constellation is a whole collection that I think is inextricably linked to Omega's pursuits in fine timekeeping. Both the movements they house and with their standard medallion caseback with 8 stars, serving as a small nod to their wins in the observatory chronometer trials throughout the first half of the 20th century. The Constellation dates back to 1952, and over the years, it's taken on many different forms. And in that process, enlisted several design traits. You had the pie pan dials, you have the C cases, Manhattan cases with those griff claws. The Constellation even has a connection to Giorgenta and now is one of the most popular luxury watches in the world, especially in parts of Asia. Also in 2015, Omega used a watch in the Constellation family, the Globemaster specifically, to bring forth, I would argue, maybe one of the most important developments in chronometry in the 21st century with the Master Chronometer certification. And now for the final brand on this list here, we have to talk about Rolex. So what is the first Rolex watch that needs to be here? Has to be the Rolex Submariner. Just the no date, because the Submariner date is technically over $10,000. So there's a quote that says, "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness." If you want the poster child of that in the watchmaking industry, I bring you the Submariner. This watch was a pioneer for dive watches, sports design, and ultimately has become a wearable piece of pop culture. And the Submariner, along with maybe the Datejust, is the most copied design in all of watchmaking. Rolex is all about making these small incremental changes over time to the design. And the Submariner of today still retains the visual trademarks of the 1950s originals. So the strange thing about what I previously just mentioned about the Submariner is that if you were to look at the early references, a lot of the inspiration would actually come from the Rolex Explorer. For example, something like the reference 6200. All of this to say is that the Explorer is also this framework that so many other sports watches from Rolex ultimately followed, and the broader industry in general. The Explorer has been hailed as one of the most complete designs of all time, and the modern editions of the 36mm Explorer is the blueprint of an upscale field watch or explorer's watch. You now also have a 40mm option available, and this serves as one of the easiest wearing pieces out there. You also have another distinctive aspect of the design, which is the 369. Now you can argue, was it the first brand to really showcase that design style? And it was clearly the watch that popularized this idea in the middle of the 20th century. Now you have the Rolex Datejust. Because the Rolex Datejust is so popular and we see it everywhere, you almost think to yourself at times like, okay, yeah, I guess that exists, but it's almost not celebrated the same way that you probably should celebrate it because of its historical importance. Introduced in 1945 as a way to commemorate the 40-year anniversary of the brand, along with the Submariner, this is arguably the most ubiquitous luxury watch in the world. I think a testament to that is how this watch is able to be successful with both men and women. This is one of these rare instances where it can play both sides. It has this elegance, it has beauty, but with its oyster case, it still can take on its fair share compared to others presenting these ideas. Also, let's not forget that this was the piece responsible for unveiling the legendary bracelet type, the Jubilee. And then for the final watch from Rolex and the final watch on this list, we have the Rolex Explorer 2. Ever since its release, this is an underdog of Rolex and never as esteemed as others mentioned thus far in this list. This is one of the most idiosyncratic designs from a brand that has been celebrated as a result of its uniformity and consistency. First introduced in 1971, the Explorer 2 was actually conceived as a watch designed for cave exploration. That dual time watch was completely redesigned in 1985 as the 16550, keeping the bold GMT hand of the original, and then the so-called polar white dial version remains among one of the most collectible Rolex pieces today. After a short stint at 40mm, the watch now exists at a 42mm case, bringing back that orange oversized triangular hand that is not considered enough for leaving its mark on the industry. But there you have it, guys. That is the list here today of the most iconic watches under $10,000. If you did enjoy the video, please give this one a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. That really does help us out. Also, if you had to pick one watch as the most iconic under $10,000, which would it be? And if it's the Submariner, the Tank, or say the Speedmaster, maybe say your second choice. Also, be sure to check out TeddyBaldisser.com. TeddyBaldisser.com is an authorized dealer for over 30 brands. Each purchase from TeddyBaldisser.com comes with quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. Also, if you have any questions about watches on our site, feel free to reach out to our team on live chat. We're on live chat 18 hours a day. And also, how we're able to continue to produce the content here is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd absolutely love to have your business. Allow us to keep doing what we're doing here. We love what we do. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.